And that was the most exciting day, probably, of my flight experience.
I did it all right.
Nobody else ever did it, so we were first.
I am the author of the book, They Flew Proud. It's the story of the civilian pilot training program. My father, Gardner Birch, was a flight instructor during World War II at the old Grove City Airport in Grove City, Pennsylvania.
My first full-time job was at the airport, and where they were giving the cadets at Slippery Rock and Grove City 10 hours of flying time. I was a line boy there at 17 years of age. We would take the airplanes, we had to put them in the hangar every night and take them out every morning. And we'd bring them out, put gas and oil in them, and put them on the line, chocks under the wheels, and then the cadets would come out and we would start the airplanes. We had to crank them by hand because these are not airplanes that had starters.
The war was going on at this time, of course, World War II, but my efforts in the war were pretty small because I was a couple of years younger than most of the other students. I could build models, and I built a lot of aircraft models. These models were then painted black, so they would be silhouettes. They were taken to the Grove City College and given up to the cadets at the college for aircraft recognition. They had to be able to recognize an aircraft in the air and very instantaneously to make sure that they were not going to fire on a friendly aircraft and make sure that the enemy aircraft didn't get a chance to fire on them.
Then I went into the service in the Air Corps, World War II. After I came out, I went back to work and decided to take up flying again.
I think it's in the book. Gardner said, if you think you're down far enough, you're not. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And then eventually I got to the point that I think I went too far.
She bounced.
When I took the plane up for the first time myself, Gardner Birch got out of the plane and he fastened the front seat belt. Well, I thought that was a little strange. He said, "There's something the matter with the tail wheel. I gotta check the tail wheel," he said. So he got out, went back to the back of the plane, and come back up, and he says, "Go ahead, go around the field one time, and come back in and park the plane." So I did, and I did it all right.
It was VJ Day. Several of us made our way to the airport, and we hatched a plot. We took the large waste baskets that were in the office, filled them with every scrap of paper we could find. We tore up newspapers and magazines, and we flew over Grove City and gave it its own interpretation or its own version of a ticker tape parade. And that was the most exciting day, probably, of my flight experience.
I loved takeoff and landing. It was much more exciting than just flying. Just flying, you just sit there, don't do anything.
I was coming back and I was at about 6,000 feet, and I hadn't switched tanks and the engine started to slow down. That jars you into instant action and switch over to the other tank. And it's been often said that it's hours and hours of probably almost boredom followed by brief panic, you know.
Gardner needed a part-time clerk in order to keep track of all the paperwork. When I started the job, I fell in love with airplanes and flying.
It sounded exciting.
I don't know.
I talked her into it. I don't know who talked her
I
into
don't
it.
know. I think we needed to do something daring.
Right.
And I'm pretty sure I was rebelling against my parents.
Well, I was interested in airplanes when I was a kid, and my neighbor on the farm had an airplane, and I was really interested in it.
Nobody else ever did it, so we were first. Probably one of the first women in that group. A lot of people after.
They copied us.
Right. We showed them how much fun it was.
Well, actually, I enjoy building planes just about as much as I do flying them today. Maybe when I was younger, I would have enjoyed flying it more than I would building, but now that I'm older, why, I enjoy both.
We've had a lot of fun. We've had some 60 years of flying, and we've never had an accident. And we just really had a lot of fun.
Again, it was just thrilling that we could do that.